My name is George Davis, and I'm a child psychiatrist, and I work in New Mexico with juvenile justice, kids, and with Child Protective Services. What we're talking about today is neurodevelopmentally or neurobiologically informed parenting. And by that, what we're talking about is, Robbyn will probably give a better description of that than I do, but we're talking about parenting that actually builds the brain, is really what it boils down to. Because a lot of the parenting practices that are developed or promoted really are focused, as we all know, on compliance, really. That's what we all want from kids. And secretly, even if we don't admit it, we wish that our kids would comply. But we also realize, except for a few marked examples, which I'm not going to point out here, who are above that kind of thing. But on the other hand, what we're talking about is the fact that certain kinds of parenting builds brains, and certain kinds of parenting practices, I won't say it destroys brains, but it doesn't build them, and it doesn't build what you want into kids. So let me proceed here. What we're going to do today, we're aiming for that last topic, regulation, dysregulation, and co-regulation, but I've got a little bit of a logic chain to go through until I get there, because there's something I want to establish about that. And so even though it says review of fundamental brain development, that's a 4-semester course. We're going to do it in one slide. So the point of this whole thing is that we're trying to just lay some groundwork so we can talk about regulation and co-regulation. So don't be alarmed. Don't be alarmed if you see those first 3 topics slipping away in 10 minutes. And then the rest of the discussions on regulation and co-regulation, or parenting practices that support those. I also work with a Child Trauma Academy too, which I think some of you know Bruce Perry's work out of Houston usually, although it's virtual. It's really not out of Houston. It's coming from the air is where it's really coming from. And this is not, none of these slides are actually his, but a lot of the things that Robbyn and I work on, a lot of the things that we've worked on for the past few years are sort of related to some of his concepts. The brain is undeveloped at birth. That's pretty obvious. I mean, it's small. It's a quarter of the adult size. It looks like an adult brain, except it's a quarter of the size. But it's really undeveloped, basically, is what it is. It's unwired internally. It organizes from the bottom up and from the inside out. And what I mean is it organizes from the brain stem up to the cortex, and from the occiput to the frontal lobes, and it really organizes from the inside out if you really look at how it develops. But that's important. The only reason that's important is because when you get down to number 4, that experiences don't have equal significance throughout development, it means that the things you're working on earlier are brainstem activities. That's what's being developed. And when I mean earlier, I mean early. I'm talking about the first 3 years, really. And in terms of importance for this kind of discussion, the first year is more important than the second year, and the second year is more important than the third year. It's a mnemonic you can use whenever you want to remember it. And then the third one is that organization and functional capacity of neurological systems is sequential. It always develops in the same sequence, but as we know, like if a kid has problems with anything from developmental to delays to maybe sensory delays, you might get things out of order. But for the most part, the brain develops, like I said, brainstem to cortex and back to front. Child abuse and neglect. I am linking explicitly, I'm linking child abuse and neglect to child rearing practices. I realize that obviously even harsh child rearing practices are not commonly recognized as being child abuse. We could dispute that all day, where the line is, or if there's a line at all. So I'm not even going to get into it. All I'm saying is that we learn certain things from child abuse that we can apply to parenting, even good parenting. And that is an important link, and that's why I put that in here. We know child abuse is common. We know that child abuse is devastating to brain development and character development and all the things that we're going to talk about coming up. And we also know that a lot of it, because the brain develops from brainstem to cortex, that wave of development that is proceeding from the brainstem to the cortex is the sensitive edge, is the leading edge of development. Once that's passed, a lot of the brainstem activities are not inaccessible, but they're relatively firmly seated. So things that happen early stay there, and they become foundational. The other thing we know for sure is that early abuse and neglect crosses boundaries, meaning it gets into affect management, it gets into mood, it gets into personality, it even affects a later ability to think. It looks like learning disabilities, it looks like a lot of different stuff, but it's more like a virus than it is like an injury, and we'll talk about the difference about those two in a second. But it's pervasive, and the reason it's pervasive is because it's foundational. We're still on abuse. It increases the likelihood of all those things you see: depression, anxiety, aggression, sleep problems, substance abuse, delinquency, criminality. All of that is really, frankly, directly related to early child abuse and neglect. That's a whole other argument, but for even everyone, I think, everyone who works in the system and everyone including, Vander Kolk himself and Martin Teicher all believe that early abuse and neglect is the scenario that leads to later criminality. And that's pretty much what we have in our prisons, basically, is a collection of very abused people. And consequently, because it affects those boundaries of attachment, affect, thought, and behavior, and because it looks like dysregulated mood, and because it looks like inattention, and it looks like lack of sleep, we call it other things. We call it bipolar affective disorder. We call it ADHD. We call it depression. We call it conduct disorder. And those are obviously misdiagnoses, but it comes from the lack of understanding what early child maltreatment does during development. In the juvenile correctional facility where I work, we do a full evaluation on every single kid who comes in, and I would say probably 65% of them carry a diagnosis of bipolar disorder because their moods are dysregulated. And of those 65% that come in with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, more than 90% are dead wrong. They're not even close. And all of that is because of lack of understanding of abuse. And we know what the central disturbance, we know what the main foundational problem is of early abuse and neglect and maltreatment. And that's essentially dysregulation. I think everybody agrees on that, but dysregulation is such a vast term. We'll talk about what exactly that means. But when you get down to someone like Bessel van der Kolk, he recognizes that when distress gets to a certain point, it becomes trauma. When it's in an unmanageable kind of event, or an event which exceeds the capacity of a kid to manage it or put it in perspective or do anything about it, it's called trauma. And when that happens to a child, and especially when the source of the comfort, the thing that's supposed to be source of the comfort, becomes a source of the distress, which is the parent, children cannot modulate their arousal. And like he says, the core of the traumatic stress is a breakdown in the ability to regulate internal states. And those breakdowns in the capacity to regulate internal states falls into various categories. Like I said, it cuts across all real boundaries, but it does figure prominently in arousal. And so the logic of this, and the reason we're doing this in this order, is brainstem activities are regulatory. And I mean regulatory in terms of arousal. And by arousal, I mean that children who have been abused and neglected and left for long periods of time alone in the crib to scream it out have a higher set point. The thermostat is set higher. They are more aroused, they have higher levels of adrenaline, they have higher heart rates, they have higher blood pressure. It's small, but they're also more reactive. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about when we talk about dysregulation of arousal. It's just got a higher set point and it's more reactive. Dysregulation of reward means that the primary reward that you have as a young infant or a young child is the attention of your primary caretaker. And that is so, I can't even tell you how driven that is by the reward system. The neurotransmitter system is organized around the reward of primary caretakers. It's the primary survival technique. It's the primary pleasure center. And when individuals use anything from cocaine to meth to heroin, it's basically hijacking the attachment reward center, which is the reward center, basically. It's the center and it's the thing itself. And it also disturbs attachment. And that is such a big word that I won't even go into it, but basically it breaks that link of trust. And the link of trust means that that's where the child finds their ability to be comforted. And we know there are degrees depending on when that abuse happens, where it happens, what age of the age of the child, how long it goes on, what kind of abuse it is. And those are what makes the distinctions between developmental trauma and PTSD. And I think you guys are a pretty wise crowd. In fact, I've heard developmental trauma or complex developmental trauma used constantly. So I assume, though, that people know that like a single incident trauma, it doesn't have to be a single incident, but it's usually a single incident trauma or an event oftentimes is what makes up PTSD. But what makes up developmental trauma is ongoing, persistent, chronic, repeated traumatic events during those first 3 years. And that's why complex trauma is, as it says, really complex. And PTSD is more discrete, and those of you that are therapists recognize that there's ways to treat PTSD because you're working with a single incident, but it's much harder. It's a very messy job to treat developmental trauma, complex developmental trauma. Now, I know most of you, we've heard the adverse childhood experience study mentioned several times. And I'm not going to repeat that whole thing. In fact, I'm not going to ask. Usually I ask who knows about the ACE study, but that would be, I'm sure there will be someone who says, I'm not going to raise my hand because he just said you all know about it. But the ACE study basically looked at adverse childhood experiences during the early years and what the outcomes of those were. And as we know, the outcomes of those were everything. Everything from cardiac disease to more autoimmune disorders to criminality to spouse abuse. Those are the long-term consequences of early adverse childhood experiences. But there's an important piece here that relates to what we're saying. Those are the 10 adverse childhood experiences. And by the way, you notice some of those are quite severe, like sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. And then some of them are quite common, like parents who are separated, having a household member who is a problem drug or alcohol user, having a household member who went to prison. Those are kind of like indirect glancing blows. And I think they pitched them like that on purpose. I should be careful what I say because some of the authors of the adverse childhood experience study are crawling around here. If you're out there, identify yourself immediately. Okay, good. Now someone's safe. This, what stays in this room, what's said in this room has to stay here. So I think that's the way they pitched them, frankly. And so it would be a range. But the important thing about that whole thing, and the reason that the last piece of our groundwork is that if you look at those slides, which you don't even need to read, all you need to notice is they go up from left to right. And that is the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the greater the effect, whether that's chronic depression, smoking, injected drug use, alcoholism. It doesn't really matter. The more of those adverse childhood experiences you have, the greater the long-term effect. And the long-term effect is, could be 40 years out. But if you have enough of them, say like if you have 6 or more, it's like the chances of being an injectable drug user are 4,000 times higher, 4,600 times higher. I know you think I'm just making that up, but look it up on the website. And so if you get enough of these ACEs, your chances of having long-term consequences are almost unbelievably escalated. And we know about the mechanism. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole mechanism, but all I want to say is the mechanism is back to what we said at the beginning, is that early development is regulatory in nature. That's the main thing that's going on between an infant and their parent, is this ability to regulate that infant. And that's why the parent never leaves them. That's why the parent holds them and protects them from the cold, hunger, loud noises, lack of sleep, illness. That the whole job of an early parenting is basically regulating that kid from the outside, really regulating the environment of that kid. And so when that doesn't happen, 2 things happen. And this relates to the adverse childhood experience study, is that the first thing that happens is a kid is forever a little bit aroused. It's the same reason when we tune our cars, we don't turn it up to race. You don't set the idle at 200, you set it at 100. Because after a while, that takes a toll, and it does take a toll on bodies. That's one of the things that wears out the body and leads to chronic illness. And the other thing that happens is because people who have a lot of childhood trauma are a little bit hyperaroused all the time, they tend to seek ways to downregulate themselves. And the easiest thing to use to downregulate are drugs and alcohol. Not just drugs and alcohol. I mean, smoking does the same thing. It regulates us. And so people seek those out, and it's that double whammy of that chronically, persistently elevated arousal and then the attempt to downregulate. And almost every kid who comes into juvenile justice will tell me, "Sir, I can't concentrate unless I smoke weed." And the weird thing is they're not even lying about it. That's really true. They really can't concentrate because they can't settle down. And that's why most of them are diagnosed with learning disabilities, but with the learning disability we're seeing is really just related to this persistent agitation. Now, so given all of that, I know that was the longest of all introductions, but it's an important kind of foundation, if you know what I mean. And the foundation is that early regulation is the whole point, and that should be the point of our parenting as well. So given that background, how do we regulate a child so that that child best develops a healthy resilience and a neurological system that is balanced? And I know we're not raising brains, we're raising children. I don't know where I was going to go with that, because it sounds like I'm going to defend something, but, you're raising a brain, frankly. You are, in some ways. And the brain, obviously, that's dysregulated will eventually take a toll on the body. It'll also take a toll on the behavior. It'll also take a toll on the environment. And certainly it takes a toll on the parents. So co-regulation, this is my definition. I'll give you a more advanced one in a minute. Co-regulation is the management of positive arousal and affect stability through mutual interactional behaviors between 2 individuals, those 2 individuals being the parent and the child, or the primary caretaker and the child. It involves all the senses, although I don't have them all on there, but it does involve all the senses, and in the sense that that when a child is regulated, it involves touch, it involves visual kinds of interaction, it involves olfactory, it involves every sense that you've got in in that interaction, and that's partly what's regulatory. And it applies early on at that regulatory stage. This is Alan Shore's definition. He calls it interactively regulated psychobiological transactions. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wow, if Alan Shore calls it that, then why aren't we listening to him? So, but, you know, you got what you got. I think he wasn't available. And so what he's saying also, the second half of that, is that those kinds of transactions are essential for optimal development of regulatory functions and a personality that can cope, or whatever you want to call it. Okay. So co-regulation is a right brain event. And the reason it's right brain is it's implicit, it's not explicit, meaning it's not verbal, it's not analytic. It's implicit, nonverbal, and intuitive, and it revolves around affect recognition, meaning knowing what the child is feeling and knowing what they're expressing with their facial kinds of expressions and gestures. It involves matching, as we'll see in just a second. It involves attunement, and also all of those things, especially early on, are primarily right-sided events. Now, how to even explain, like so much of the early development of new infants is right-sided in nature. There's a burst of growth on the right side for the first year and a half. And the other thing is that all this intuitive recognition that's going on, which is, it's verbal, but it's really not verbal. I mean, it's not related to the meaning of the words. It's related to the sound of the words. It's related to the cadence of the words. It's related to things that are picked up intuitively. And it's also related to other kinds of physical functions. For example, arousal and danger. So a kid that is well regulated and has that kind of intuitive, reciprocal connection with a parent is better regulated, has less fear, and that parent becomes the signal for safety, is what happens. And all of that is reinforced by by neurotransmitters as well. It's also regulated to what they say is subcortical and brainstem structures. Really what they're talking about is the level of arousal. The very brainstem thing I'm talking about is directly related to early right-sided regulatory and co-regulatory events. And that's the place where all of those memories that a child might have of safety and security are stored in the right side. But the interesting thing about that is it's largely unconscious. We don't really have words for it. And so it affects, for the rest of your life, it affects the way you see other people and what kind of sense of comfort you have in other persons and whether or not you seek out other people for comfort. It'll affect things like whether or not someone's touch actually makes you alarmed and uncomfortable, or whether someone's touch makes you feel more secure. And that's the kind of stuff that gets stored in the right brain. It's very difficult to get to. One, because it's early, like I said, a lot of it's connected directly to brainstem kinds of functions. But it's right-sided. It's not analytic. There aren't clear verbal descriptions for it. It's intuitive. Now let me just go over a little of these studies, and then I'm going to turn it over to Robbyn. Back in 1987, this is the only neuroscience article you'll see quoted from 1987. But it was the reason they quote it is because it's a seminal article, and this Greenow defined three different kinds of experience. Experience dependent. The second one there is experience is something you would learn simply from just directly learning it, meaning there's no template made for it. It's like riding a bike or learning French. French as a language has no template. Language itself does have a template, and that's a good distinction to make between experience dependent and experience expectant. Experience expectant development is that kind of development that is required for the normal development of the child. They're born without that regulatory equipment. They have to have that regulatory equipment, and the expectant kind of template for that is the primary caretaker. It's ready, and that's why infants will do things like early mimicry. That's why they'll make eye contact. It's why they're cute, probably. It could be just because they're tiny, but we don't really know. But nevertheless, it's the things that engage the parents, and by engaging the parents, they're engaging the attention and the regulatory interaction with that parent. And that's experience expectant. It's a template that has to be fulfilled. And if it's not fulfilled, if the child, instead of having that mutual regulatory experience with the parent, just lays in the crib and screams their head off while the mom is either doing drugs or is gone or is depressed or is whatever is going on with the primary caretaker, then that kind of experience expectant brain development doesn't happen. I'll go through 3 more slides. First is mirroring. Now we're down to hardcore kind of co-regulation. That little child looks, selectively at the face of the primary caretaker. And by selectively, I mean she's seeking out a face and eyes, the proximity of that particular person. She looks there and she sees reflected back at her the positive affect. And so the affect itself, the expression, is mirrored. But what's also informed by that is she sees a matching kind of identical affect. So the expression and the affect get mirrored together in both individuals, and that child knows, this is how I feel. This is what happiness feels like. The same thing applies to sadness. That the child cries and the parent shows a sign of distress, and the child recognizes in the parent, like, this is what pain or whatever it is feels like. And so that's the basis of empathy right there. Now, everyone will talk a lot about mirror neurons, and even though the mirror neurons are the neurological basis for this, they're not really driving it entirely. Because the mirror neurons are they're a cluster of neurons that's scattered throughout the brain. It's not in one particular place. But those mirror neurons, like when you see somebody else taking an action, that same part of your brain that they are using fires off in you. So I see someone pick up a cup, and that same motor neurons that person used to pick up that cup fire in my brain. And it's true with affect, too, is the same kind of neurological equipment that you're seeing in the eyes of your primary caretaker are basically being matched in yours. It's the ultimate kind of synchrony, if you know what I mean. It's actually kind of shocking, so much that people really have not unpacked what that mirror neuron does. But I will say this, the mirror neuron, even though it does, it figures out what the action is and duplicates it in the eyes of the watcher, the same kind of neurons that they're watching in the person that's being watched. But the interaction with the parent is what gives it meaning. And so if that's a positive experience, then that experience of affect and affect matching and affect regulation and mirroring becomes a very positive experience. And it gets loaded into the right side of the brain. It's implicit, and it lasts, and it lasts, and it lasts, and it lasts. So like Daniel Siegel gives this example where he says that, if a child sees a raised hand, that could mean anything. It could mean you're hailing a cab. It could mean that you're waving away flies, or it could mean that that's the precedent to abuse. It could mean anything. So the interpretation has yet to be loaded in. The matching happens. The matching is built in as part of the neurological equipment, but the interpretation doesn't. And usually the interpretation is good. Attunement. all attunement says is that when the parent looks at the child, they're not just mirroring back the physical expression, they're also matching the level of arousal. And that's how co-regulation happens, basically, is that the parent regulates themselves in order to regulate the child. Matching happens when you match attunement, you're matching how aroused and could be distressed, could be positive too. We all know that if you get a kid too excited, they, they don't go to bed, put it that way. And then contingent communication. Contingent communication is the action where a parent accurately perceived what the gesture, the action, the cry, the wish, the vocalization, the face, accurately perceives that and then responds in an appropriate kind of way. And what the child gets from that is basically like, well, my actions have meaning and my actions have response. And I'm going to get somewhere in the world because things make sense. When I cry, I get these diapers changed. And I mean now. Let's get these things off here. And they mean that in almost every sense. Like the parent looks at the child and recognizes what the signal is. And the child gets a sense of agency from that. And in particular, the child gets a sense of agency related to that parent-child interaction, and really which eventually generalizes to all interactions altogether. The important thing about this is like when, as we all know, I'm not going to ask who has young children here, who had young children long ago, but we all know that these perfect kind of synchronous interactions are storybook kinds of things. They happen, for just golden moments, and if you catch them on film, they're yours forever. But we also know that ruptures happen constantly. You misread a kid's signal. You're not there when the child cries. The child looks for you and you're not available, or you're busy. Or the child's sibling is, angry about something else. And so a lot of the time is spent in repair, which is just as important, because the idea of a repair means that interaction is reestablished, and that's partly what leads to resiliency, the idea that this can be fixed. It can be fixed, and it can be fixed primarily because the kid has agency, because the kid reestablishes the interaction, the parent reestablishes the interaction, and that sense of possibility is established. And so Ed Tronick is the guy that made the still face experiment. Who's seen that still face clip? Is there anybody who hasn't? You should look that up. I won't do it now. I've done it so many times that I think I've worn out my digital drive. No, I'm not going to do it tonight. Deb is encouraging me on. But there's other things to talk about if we run out of time. Ed Tronick, though, this is the kindest. You would not believe he's a Harvard professor. He's so kind. And this was due, I know, you'd think he'd be mean and narcissistic, wouldn't you? But I don't get it. He's not like that at all. He gave this lecture called Catch Our Children Before They Fall. It's on YouTube again, too, as well. But the point I was going to make is that they're filming this mother and this child. And then there's this sort of ripple, or it's more than a ripple, it's a ruffle almost in the relationship, and the child kind of recoils and the mom does, but you couldn't see anything. You thought, what happened there? And so they slowed it down, and they had to get down to this interaction. It had to get down to a third of a second. They had to get down to a third of a second before they could see it. And what happened was the mom and the baby are interacting with each other. And it's so pleasant that the child kind of gets overactivated, a little giddy about the whole thing. And she reaches out and grabs the mom's hair. You almost didn't see that. It happened so fast. The mom, in response, kind of pulls back like that. But the main thing she does is she gives this what they called the bared teeth smile. And the bared teeth smile, we all know. Remember, Robbyn, how you said how frightening it is? People that talk with you and they're furious, but they're still smiling. Anybody hate that as much as I do? So what happens is, she gives that, but it's such a flash. It happened in a third of a second. In a half a second, that kid pulls back and sort of does this startle plus cry response. And then another half of the second, the mom has recollected herself and reconnected with that child. All of this they couldn't see any of this because until they slowed this sequence down for, into thirds and halves of seconds. But it's all perfectly obvious there. And it tells you a lot about this mirroring. It tells you that it cannot be constructed or pre-planned. It has to be largely intuitive. You can know it going into it, but a lot of it is instinctive, and a lot of it's based on possibly the kind of relationship you had with your own parent too. So now I really am going to stop and let Robbyn do her job that she was hired to do.
My name's Robbyn Bennett, and I've been a clinician for, I think, 16, 17 years. I've worked in the field of trauma specifically, and I'm happy to begin talking about neurodevelopmentally informed parenting because I think we learn so much from trauma. And working with traumatized children, they don't tolerate certain kinds of interventions or ways of control or manipulation that other children will. So it tells us a lot about the brain. So what I want to talk to you about is there's so much parenting material out there right now, and I can hardly keep up with a lot of it. But what's interesting about it is that I think that it's helpful when you're a parent or if you work with parents to know how to take information that you read out there and figure out, does it fit in with a brain model? And so what I'm hoping you'll walk away with today is an understanding of how to if you read a book, figure out what parts of this are nourishing to the brain and attachment development and what might actually compromise that so that you have a nice bucket to put things into. And this is largely based on the work of Dr. Bruce Perry at the Child Trauma Academy. A lot of his work in my training with him has been very useful in terms of working just with parents, not just traumatized families, but mainstream families with children, particularly little children that are dealing with hyperactivity, aggression, bullying, not following direction, stressed out parents. So there's really three components to thinking about what would make a parenting ideology or intervention neurodevelopmentally informed. The first is that it must emphasize the relational reward system of the brain. And that's why I've given you this handout, because we're going to talk about the reward system inside of your own brain, because, really it's your brain that's holding and allowing the child's brain to grow and develop. So it needs to be relationally rewarding. It needs to support self-regulation, and it needs to be sensory sensitive. Just take a minute and fill this out. I'm just going to give you a moment to take a look at this. And these are 6 categories of sensory development. And you've been in this conference all day now. So I'd like you to look at it and fill it out for yourself based on when you're most stressed out. So, being touched on some body parts. So you're either going to avoid it mostly, you're going to seek it, or you'll feel mixed about it, or it won't matter. The reason I'm having you think about it in terms of when you're stressed out is because it changes. But what we're really interested in is that our functioning is state dependent. And so if you know what your sensory system is like in a state of arousal, that will help you understand when you're aroused. And that's really important in terms of being able to regulate a child's experience, because many of us will pop out of our sensory experience and be in a slight dissociation. You're doing it now. You're probably fading out, you're sometimes listening, you're sometimes writing, you're sometimes not thinking at all. And that's actually really healthy in a certain degree. But If you do it a lot, because our culture is very sensory insensitive, then you lose your primary connection really to small children because they operate primarily out of their sensory experience. So I'm going to go on, but you're welcome just to finish filling that out because I'm going to talk to you about how to use this tool, actually. So relationally rewarding system is essentially everything that Dr. Davis was talking about. It's the feeling of safety, ultimately, on an emotional level. Something's relationally rewarding if you're in contact with the child and you're mirroring and you're tuning in. Now, those of you that work with children in any therapeutic fashion, you probably have a master's degree in the relational reward system. That's what we're mostly doing, is reparenting. So I love this because when you're in, if you grow up in a home where you have a lot of stress and it's a difficult early beginning, you don't get sufficient relational reward, you're going to rely on other reward systems more so. And those will include some of those on this list. You may become more reliant on touch. You may become more reliant on movement. And so, really, the ultimate reward system is the relational reward system. But you can see that, of course, sweet, salt, and fatty foods right about now would be pretty nice. That's a good reward as well. Particularly if I'm sitting in a lecture and I'm not really getting mirrored. I'm just sitting and listening. I mean, this is not relationally rewarding unless, of course, you're able to say what you need to say. And I do want to invite you just to raise your hand and ask me questions as we go along because it really will help you stay with it a little bit better. If you're just sitting and receiving, then you have to start relying on other things like wiggling your feet or eating or daydreaming. Or coffee. And of course, it can be more serious if the lack of relational reward is great enough. So in terms of thinking about self-regulation, this is Dr. Bruce Perry's work. There's really 3 ways that we modulate our affect, and not just our emotions, but also our bodies. One is the somatosensory soothing, so it's getting enough touch. It's the movement, motor vestibular experience on that assessment that you're filling out. One of the best ways to soothe little babies is to move them in space. And we know that if children are not moved in space and they don't get that sense of where their body stops and starts, it's much harder to soothe them. So this is very important if you're working with traumatized children, but it's also incredibly important if you're just raising a little child, because children under 5 are really developing these systems. This is the brainstem and the lower brain. So what's really important are things like breathing and like rhythmic breathing, being aware of your breath, walking, running, swimming, doodling, humming, singing, all the things you're not allowed to do in here. But if you were a bunch of 5-year-olds, I wouldn't expect you to sit still, right? I'd let you be wiggling your feet and doing all those kinds of things. But you have a lot of prefrontal cortex that sort of overrides and allows you to sort of kind of hang in. The other is cortical modulation, and that's the frontal part of the brain. It really has a lot to do with how we respond to children and our relational response to them. That's the relational reward system. And then the last is dissociation, which is really helpful. So it's pretty normal. You're doing it now. I'm doing it sometimes because this thing is weird to talk into. It's strange, and I'm floating, and then I come back, and we do this all the time as a way. You listen, and then you miss a part, and then you come back. But you can do it more severely if the reward is not there. Little children can go away for a long time. Have you ever seen, when children are on the television, they get into a dissociative trance, and they get off, and they're kind of not there. Have you seen this? Where, and you pay for it because you've got to now get them moving or get them to eat something or get them to do something, because now they've essentially been in a relationship to the television that is not reciprocal. And so it's been starving them of that regulation. This, of course, just supports what Dr. Davis was talking about, is nurture. The relational reward system is the driving factor in this particular study in poverty. So all the things we think about, making sure there's school lunches, making sure children have all sorts of physical care. In fact, the driving factor is the relationship itself between the parent and the child, and if there's sufficient relational reward. And Alan Shore says that it's essentially your brain is holding the brain of the child. One brain holds the brain of the other, and that's how children develop. So I love this study. It's so interesting. So this is just to tell you that this idea of resiliency has a lot to do with how healthy your reward system is. How many of you do know about the ACE study? Have you seen the resiliency questionnaires? How many have seen that? Okay, I'm going to leave my business card here, and if you want, send me an email, and I'll send you my presentation, but I'll also send you a copy of this. It's a response to the ACEs, is that some people have a high ACE score, but they feel pretty good and they're pretty healthy. And what they're finding is that it's because they have greater resiliency, and it has to do with how much they depend on relationship, how much they feel that relationship is there for them. They don't feel alone in the world. They feel loved. They feel supported. And so that sense of relational safety, of attunement, really mitigates brain development. So in this study, what they did is you were looking at this image, and you would say, would I like this person? And I would say yes. And then it would say, do I think they're likely to like me? And they might say, I would think yes, but then it would respond no. Now, the participant knew this was a setup, it's not for real, but it still caused an opioid response in the brain. So people that had low resiliency produced less opioid response to that social rejection. And people that had higher resiliency had a greater opioid response. So the idea here that Sue is positing is that if you have low resiliency, social rejection is more painful. You don't have enough painkiller to cope with it. And also, you don't have as much pleasure associated with positive interactions. This is this is such an amazing study. They took 18-month-olds and looked at, how they responded when the mother left the room. So this is an attachment test to figure out, is the child ambivalently attached or securely? And it has to do with how much distress the child expresses when the mother departs and how much distress when the mom comes back. And there's sort of a normal level of it. But children that are not securely attached will either not even notice the mother and wander off and not acknowledge her return, or they'll become hysterical and very, very distressed. So if there's this ambivalent attachment because the child does not feel secure, the attunement isn't really there, they found that in their 20s, when they showed them negative images, they were able to downregulate. When Dr. Davis was talking about the need to downregulate arousal, their brain could do this, but their brain did not upregulate to positive images. So the effect of an ambivalent attachment has a lot to do with how much pleasure you're going to experience ongoing. This study was out of Princeton, that 4 out of 10 of 14,000 children have an ambivalent attachment to their parents. So we're not talking about child abuse here, we're talking about general parenting practices and how secure are children with their parents in today's culture. And of course, those lead to aggression and defiance and hyperactivity because it's basically hyperarousal. The arousal system is disorganized and overly sensitive. So here's the perfect parent and the perfect therapist. I love, this is Bruce Perry's work, where if the child, and when you think of this continuum, calm to terror, it's really a brain state. Don't think of that so much as emotion. Think of that as a brain state. That when the child is in a distressed state, like an infant is often, or a toddler, you rise up, you upregulate a little, and you get a bit aroused to their distress, hopefully not too much, but enough to mirror it, and then through mirroring and attunement, you bring them back into a regulated state. And if this happens over and over and over again, you are building in resilience. But if you're stressed out and you're hyperaroused, so a lot of your people that you work with may have a higher ACE score, may have low resiliency, they might have an activated arousal, they're starting at alert. So it's easier for them when they get when they're trying to regulate the child, that they're going to themselves get too dysregulated. And then what do? They get angry or they fade out and dissociate, because, of course, dissociation is one way to cope, as well as just getting furious. And when that happens, the parent is then regulating themselves, trying to come down into their own calm state, but the child is left in this state of arousal. And that's what sets a new baseline for the child, is that they don't really come back down into a calm state. So this is what we're up to, is that if you have, here's your system, the brainstem, DE is midbrain. It's basically the diencephalon, but it's essentially satiety, large motor skills. A lot of what you're looking at on this sensory assessment is this bottom half of the brain. So it's really important to know where your sensitivity is, because if you get tired, the prefrontal cortex won't save you all the time. Like over time in the day, if you get tired, you're going to operate more out of that vulnerability in the lower brain. And so it's really important to know where is your state of arousal and what are your sensory sensitivities, because you are co-regulating with that child. And so it's true for neglect. It's also true for just little children. So I want to talk a little bit about empathy-based parenting versus operant conditioning. The research seems to show that unconditional relational reward that is based on attunement, interpretation, where you stay with the child, so you don't do time out, you do time in. This is all much more effective in terms of building neural pathways and self-regulation. Now, punishment is the second most effective, but it's also possibly the most damaging. And then thirdly is conditional reward, which is sticker systems. And if you do this, you'll get this. And trying to, reward the child's behavior rather than mirror their internal state and identify their needs. And so really a lot of the trauma intervention that we use is unconditional relational reward, like collaborative problem solving with Dr. Ross Green, systems like this. And of course, that's what we do in therapy. That's why therapy is effective. It's reparenting. It's not conditional. It's not based on punishment and reward. It's based on what Carl Rogers talked about, genuineness, acceptance, and empathy, and that your very presence and your very ability to digest the experience of the other person is self-soothing to that person. And that's what builds in regulation. So why does punishment not work? Well, Dr. Alfie Kohn has some ideas like it makes people mad, it eventually loses its effectiveness, it does erode relationship, and it makes children more self-centered. But from a neurobiological perspective, when it makes people mad or children mad, it also activates arousal. So using fear as a way to control behavior has a secondary problem. In the moment, it can control the child, but it does tend to create an arousal in the child. And if they anticipate you might do it again through a threat or a look, it doesn't even have to be a direct punishment, then they're going to operate at that sort of level of arousal. It also erodes the relationship, so it starves the relationally rewarding system, because you're really trying to build into the relational reward system. And to do that, there has to be a sense of attunement and safety and trust. And children that are more self-centered, in my view, than when they come into my office, it's because they're chronically aroused. And I often ask the parents, like, what is Henry like when he gets up in the morning, right? He pops out of bed, he's immediately running around, he's very active, he wants to watch TV. When I hear that kind of thing, I want to talk about, well, what are the rhythms of this family? Because part of building in reward into the brain is to do it when the brain is calm, not in a state of arousal. So this study was talking about hostile attributions. If you assign an interpretation to the child's behavior that's negative, you're much more likely to abuse the child. So these were mothers in the East Coast that were middle-class moms, and they asked them questions like, if a baby throws some food on the ground when they're in their high chair, are they doing that to get on your nerves? Are they wetting to get attention? Kind of hostile intentions to the child's behavior. If you scored 5, you were twice as likely to meet the criteria for overt child abuse. And 25% of these women scored a 5. So in terms of early intervention, there's a lot we can do in terms of helping moms calm down, because if you're aroused, you see children as a threat when they're not so much of a threat. So your own perception is altered. So this is great stuff. Dr. Ross Greene, Lives in the Balance, he says children do well when they can, simply because it is preferable. It feels good to do well, and that when they don't do well, it's because they have lagging skills and unsolved problems. But I would also say that Bruce Perry's work needs to be in here, because children can also have undeveloped somatosensory experience. And it's really important to know what it's like to be in the body of a child, particularly because that alters depending on the level of arousal. So a child's sensory experience, like tags bothering them, or I need tight clothes, or I have to have loose clothes, or I don't like this food, or I like that food, or they're pushing all the time. I get children that come in and they push on the thing, and they have to do this all the time, but they're not always that way. But when they're aroused, this is a sensory way of regulating. So it's really important to understand how vulnerable is the sensory system, and they'll use it as a substitute for the lack of relational reward often. Parents, very sophisticated parents sometimes I work with, that don't know how to mirror feeling, don't know how to be present in a tantrum without themselves trying to talk the child cognitively out of a tantrum. So the second piece is self-regulatory equipment. And this is sort of like, how aroused do you get? Where, children that are traumatized, when they get aroused, they stay aroused longer. And as we get older, even if we had a rough time as a child, we maybe learn to regulate better, but you might find you're more vulnerable to sensory inhibiting environments, where you have to sit a lot, where you're on a computer a lot, when you work a long day, when you're in traffic. These are all sensory overload to the lower part of the brain. So this is a great way to think about what does it really mean to have an arousal problem. If nothing else, to me this is the most important part of this lecture, is that here's the mental state, calm. Now, the little boy I was telling you about, Henry, does not wake up calm. That's a problem. So I'm not so much worried about him out in the afternoon when he's going to have a fit with his mother and there's going to be a lot of problems. I'm really thinking about where am I building in neurological resiliency when he's calm first thing in the morning. That's when I'm building it in. The more alert you become, you lose access to the neocortex. Cognitive interventions become useless at that point. So it's really important to know where is the level of arousal of a child so you can sort out, okay, should I be trying to reason with this child? Should I be trying to rock this child? Should I just try to get food in him? Should I get him moving and walking? And as the continuum, the child goes up the continuum, and this is true of adults as well, we become more concrete, more emotional. We're operating out of the lower brain. So it's important when you're thinking about the capability of your own child and yourself is, how aroused am I? Because several things happen when we're aroused that are a problem. One is our sense of attachment is compromised, our sense of security in relationships. So as I'm getting tired as a mother, I'm not feeling as attached to my child. I'm not feeling like I even trust this child as much. And the child feels the same way. Also, the developmental stage, is going to drop the more aroused a child is, and sensory sensitivities are going to become more increased. So take a look at this sensory tool for a moment. I had a little boy who, it's interesting, I always have the parents do this as well, and then I have them do it for the child. So sometimes, like I had a child where he had a very consistent motor vestibular sensory assessment. He loved everything that had to do with movement. But he had a lot of ambivalence around touch and around audio sensory experience. And the interesting thing is that this child needed quiet, and his father needed to have the TV on all the time. But what I found, I said, you're in a fix because you need sound, because he's more on the dissociative continuum, and he needs sound in order to feel rhythmic, but his child actually needs a very different sensory experience. I had another child who had a lot of yelling and hitting as a young child, and he was about 12, and he had a very disorganized visual and also sensory, in terms of audio and touch. Was completely averse to many things. But he liked touch, he just didn't like certain kinds of clothes and things like that. His mother was a foster child herself. She couldn't tolerate any touch. But this child's motor vestibular capability was he would go up on buildings and do, jump off things and do amazing, terrifying physical things. His motor vestibular system was consistently rewarding. It was one thing he could always do to feel good. So the work was, how do we organize these disorganized systems? And so this isn't just an emotional issue. This is how do we get into physical regulation with our children? So, of course, what is your state of arousal? I think I'm perfectly logical when I'm angry. I've had to just not trust being angry because I trust my thoughts when I'm angry. The midbrain isn't very discriminating. So it's important in working with your child to understand your own level of arousal and understand that you may move to, explaining punishments, consequences, which are essentially punishment, because you yourself feel out of control and reactive. And so the most important thing to do as a parent is to get back into your own state of calm, to manage your own level of arousal and not worry about intervening in that moment and controlling a child or making them do something you want. So the tantrum is seen in Dan Siegel's language as distress rather than defiance. And sometimes it's distressful for us as well. So I'm always thinking about how does her body feel right now? This is my granddaughter in my garden. In the morning she's amazing, but I like to go on long walks. And I like to go out to eat later at night. And often that's a foolish idea, because for her sensory needs change over the course of the day. So sometimes it's just about where are you at in your body, how are you feeling, what do you need, and trying to get a rhythm, an attunement but inside of yourself. Where am I at? And then find your way from there to attune to the child. And I can't really underestimate how incredibly important, I work with a lot of mainstream parents now as well as traumatized kids, because I work in Portland and Intel is nearby, so they're super smart parents. And they're so cognitive, and they talk too much to their children. I see, and they don't just know how to get into this sort of thing where you're paying more attention to the cadence of your voice because the child's not listening to words right now, and to be aware of that feeling, the sound, the rhythm, eye contact, smiling. So this is just important, I think. Does anybody need this right now? I'll pass it around. Your body has to be calm. I'm really a believer in yoga. How many of you have read any of Bessel van der Kolk's work? I love him because he really is targeting the lower brain, and he understands how afflicted we are as cognitive creatures and cerebral creatures. Bruce Perry talks a lot about this all the time, is how do you get into a regulated state, because you don't have to say the right thing. You just have to feel good in your body. And when you feel good, all that right brain knowledge that Dr. Davis was talking about, the child just knows. And so often when a child comes to my office, I don't have a lot of things for them to play with. There is a sand tray, but I'll sit on the floor and eat something. And then they join me, and I just spend time following their cue, and not educating, not introducing a cognitive idea, not doing any kind of correction, just being with. I want to say this about harsh punishment. Is some of the research is showing it's transactional, which means it's back and forth, no surprise, right? Because if you are harsh to the child, your own mirror neurons are experiencing the child's experience, and it has a cascading effect, and it seems to be that boys are the most vulnerable. So my passion is really to eliminate punishment of boys. They externalize more. They tend to lean into the hyperarousal range rather than the dissociative. Dissociative is compliant. Girls dissociate and they're good students, but they don't necessarily do that well. They're using dissociation. It's not a problem, but little boys often are more on the hyperarousal continuum. They're not well behaved, and then they get more negative feedback, and it goes round and round and round. So there's this amazing research, and if you do pick up my business card, I'll send this to you. It's called Two Open Windows. Now, this is seminal. It's not what I'd call, there's definitely supportive research, but it's a beginning idea. But what they're talking about is the neurological changes in parents when they become parents. And that there's certain changes to the sensory, to the reward system, to the self-regulatory system, and the social system that makes them more vulnerable. And also makes them more receptive, so that you tend to be more empathic to the needs of your child and more attuned. But if you deal with trauma, you're also likely to be more agitated and aroused. So it's important to figure out, if you yourself are not particularly resilient, what are your pattern repetitive habits of self-care that are going to support your ability to lower arousal, considering the neurological changes that do occur most likely in the parent's brain as well as the child's. So this idea of co-regulation is it should feel good both ways. The idea of parenting should feel good. This is just to give you a little bit of idea about somatosensory dysregulation. In this study, background television disrupts executive functioning. It has something probably to do with attentional, just hearing it, and the stimuli of that. And of course, high-risk children are more vulnerable. And it says that children watch television on an average of 4 hours a day. Dr. Bruce Perry, I heard him in an interview, said children under 2 shouldn't watch TV. A lot of children are watching TV. These are awesome. They figured out, this again is a lower brain intervention. Like, don't you wish they had them here where we could be pedaling? Seriously, I went kayaking yesterday afternoon. I was supposed to go to a meeting. They didn't have pedals under the table, and I just, I have a vulnerable sensory reward system, and I don't know where a yoga studio is here. 7 to 9-year-old children who run around for at least 70 minutes a day have improved executive. So I'm so much brighter and capable for you today because I went and ran off and got in the water yesterday. But there's not a lot of permission for the motor vestibular needs, yeah? Caffeinate, skip meals, sit in a cubicle. I mean, our culture is very insensitive to our bodies. And that really ends up being really hard on little children because they're like the canary in the mine, right? They're the first ones that's going to start squeaking when the family system is a sensory nightmare, right? Where there's no rhythm, not enough physical touch. If harsh punishment actually is directly correlated in an inverse way to physical touch. So families that tend to use harsh punishment tend to touch less. So it's important to think about what's it physically like to be in the home. This one is really hard for me to help parents understand because they want me to help them figure out why is Johnny flipping out when he gets home from school. He gets in the car, halfway home in the car, he's screaming, kicking the back of the seat, being a complete lunatic, and hitting the other kid next to him when they're like car shuttling and trying to get home. That's important to figure out how to avoid that. But in terms of really addressing the issue, I love this idea. This, again, is Bruce Perry. So the first is to regulate the child. That's the arousal system. So he's flipping out and having a tantrum is not a good time to say, flipping out in tantrum, I need you to use your words. That's probably not going to regulate the child. What probably will regulate the child is if you get down on their level and you slow down and you take time to let them come back into equilibrium with you. So regulate them. It's true of traumatized children and normal children and adults. Then relate. That's when you relate, you mirror affect. So even mirroring affect can be really irritating to a tantruming child. I had this amazing educator. She does parenting classes, and I was supposed to pretend I was having a tantrum. So I did. I'm really good at that. And this big guy was working with me, and he was so nice, but he's really tall, and you could tell he was afraid to do the wrong thing. And he's like, "You seem angry." And I grabbed the paper, and I was into it, and I was just ignoring him. And she came over, and she said, "I noticed your hands on the paper." And I instinctively looked at her. It was amazing. There was no mirroring of affect. That would have been irritating. I know I'm angry. That ticks me off more. I don't want to hear that. In that really dysregulated state, she just described my hand. And I couldn't help but look at her. And then she said, "Okay." And she just nodded her head and stayed with me in her body. And I was faking it, but you know how when you fake it, you kind of can sort of feel it? So it's kind of familiar, actually, this place. That's regulation. So body regulation, how to communicate on a body level. I'm safe, and I'm here with you, and I'm not in any rush to teach you a lesson or anything. So once the child's regulated, or your husband, then feed them, right? Oh, God, I have something to talk to you about. I'm going to feed you first. Then you relate. Gee, you look like your brow is furrowed. You look sad. Then you can try that. And then if it blows up, go back to just being in the body and regulating in the body and just noticing your own breath and recognizing that child is reading so much that's not words. They know. You can't fake it with parenting. Or with traumatized kids in a residential treatment center. They know if you're scared. They know it. They know if you're angry. So just get back into your breath, find your own safe place. And then you can reason. And I always tell parents, I have these parents, they're like, they're just kind of wonderful people, really. And they want to teach this child, we really don't want to hit mommy. But I have helped them sort of move from that stage of discussion to not do it at all after the event. Don't talk about it at all. Talk about it when he's truly safe, because that's when you build in regulation, a calm mind. So the morning hours are the most important. They're the most important. That's when a child is waking up. That's when you can connect. That's when there's no pressure. That's when you build in regulatory experience. That's when you build in emotional attunement and you build in your thoughts about morality. That's when you talk about things. So I just want to introduce this idea to you. If you come and get this card, I have a barcode on it, and you can scan it, and it'll take you to my website. And on there is a Positive Discipline in Everyday Parenting webinar series. It's free. You can give it to your parents to download and to watch. And it essentially is talking about, it's going through Joan Durant's book, which is... this is a fundamental way to parent nonviolently. And I mean utterly nonviolently, and to abandon rewards and punishment in lieu of neurobiologically informed, attachment-based parenting. And I'll just say briefly, this program you can just walk through with parents, and they start with their long-term goals, because that's a very high-functioning thing. Is my long-term goal to get this child out the door with shoes on and her hair braided, because I don't want the teacher to think I don't brush her hair, and I'm 24 years old, because I actually do care about that when you're 24, you worry about judgment. Or is my long-term goal that my child can make decisions and figure out when it's cold and which shoes should be on or when should they be off, right? It's a big difference in how I'm going to intervene. Providing warmth, hugely important, and has a lot to do with your sensory capabilities. So when you look on your sensory tool, are there systems on there that are mixed for you? You know, are you consistently seeking out audio experience, or are there or do you sometimes not like certain kinds of, and how is that the same or different than your child? Because you can't provide warmth if you're aroused. So providing structure as well in this program is about providing information, being able to share with the child information about the world. Like, this is how things work. Everyone's going to sit here in this conference, and if you jump up on the table, it's not really like allowed here. It could be at a daycare, but here you have to sit. It's just like helping them understand the rules. And then really getting into how the child thinks and feels. Now, the understanding how children think and feel is important, but I also think knowing how they feel in their body is important, particularly little children if you're working with tantrums and things like that. And the last is problem solving, and I love this program. I want to offer this to you. I will send this to you. It's a wonderful problem description list on lagging skills and unsolved problems. Difficulty handling transitions, shifting from one mindset or task to another. I mean, this just goes on, this list. And this is from Dr. Ross Green's work on collaborative problem solving. It's a great way to begin to think about what are the needs of the child versus how badly behaved they are, and how that makes me feel completely dysregulated because, first of all, a tantruming child I find to be very arousing. You know, and it's true for a lot of parents, particularly if you're at a restaurant. Yeah, and people are staring at you and judging. So what this is, again, is like the business card. It's essentially just a free resource for parents to be able to watch a webinar. Other parents are calling and asking questions and applying it in real life. And, well, I don't know. This thing is kind of botched up, but that's Thich Nhat Hanh. I love this saying. Someone who's angry is someone who does not know how to handle their own suffering. They are the first victim, and we are the second. You know, once you can see that your child or your husband or your friend or your neighbor who's angry is the first victim, then that's that first place we can open to compassion. And we no longer want to punish. We want to understand. And help them suffer less. One last thing I want to tell you, and then you please ask questions if you have them. I'm the founder of StopSpanking.org, mostly because of Bruce Perry's work, and realizing that this early developmental injury does not show up. You hit 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, they look like they comply, they dissociate a little, they tend to be more hyper-aroused, it seems fine enough. They hit adolescence, you've got a very different picture. Because of the way that the brain prunes, you know, the development of the child. We know on brain scans of children that are hit, particularly if they're hit with an implement, the brain damage to the hippocampus looks very similar in adolescents and in their 20s as to children who are overtly physically abused. So I'm really interested in helping parents have alternatives because 85% of parents who do spank their children don't want to. And a lot of it has to do with hyperarousal. So what we've created is a helper kit, and if anyone's interested in this, we're, that's part of our little fundraiser. But essentially what it is it's an online resource of neurodevelopmental resources. It's got Facebook groups that parents can join that are closed, that are safe, that they can go ask questions. It has little stickers that you can stick on things and little cards you can give to parents who are struggling. If you're at a restaurant and someone's hitting their child, you can just hand them a helper card that says you're not alone, you're good enough, so is your child. Give them some support to help them out of that dysregulated state and give them some resources that they can get help so that we begin to not look at people at restaurants who have children that are badly behaved or not look at them. I don't know which is worse. And there's an article in there on intervening that I wrote about a woman in the airport who was really angry with her son and how I intervened. So I hope that's helpful. Do you have any questions of myself or Dr. Davis at this point, please? Any thoughts about this? You guys... Right.